Faith. It's a word that all Christians know, yet if you put 100 of them in a room and ask them for an exact definition of what it is, then you're likely going to get close to 100 different responses. Since our faith is absolutely core to not only our salvation, but also on how we were able to have hope, trust, and peace in any situation that we encounter in this life, then I think it is imperative that we all take the time to fully explore this concept. This here is the 36th video of the verse-by-verse study through the book of Matthew, and today we come to a verse where Jesus encounters a Roman centurion, which, just to clarify, means that this was a person whose very role in the Jewish society was to oppress and extort the Israelites. And based on Jesus' conversation with him, our Messiah boldly declares that this man has greater faith than anyone else that he's encountered in all of Israel, the very nation that was God's chosen people. A powerful statement that no doubt shook every Jew to their core, and as we will see, Jesus then also gives a 1-2 punch that most certainly dropped everyone in earshot who was already staggering from trying to come to terms with what he had just said. In today's study, we will not only be fully exploring and expanding upon today's passage like we always do, but since Jesus himself marveled at this centurion's faith, we will also be exploring the very topic of faith itself. We've got a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. All right, now before we do get started, for those of you that are new here, I am James West, and this of course is the Lion's Den Academy, where the goal is to bring you closer to God through an in-depth study of His Word. And with that said, if you are new here and you're looking for help with diving deep into the Bible and tackling theological and historical concepts as they come up in Scripture, then I would love to have you join the Academy here by clicking the subscribe and notification bell below. With that said, let's start by reading today's passage, which is found in Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 through 13, which reads, "When he had entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, 'Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, suffering terribly.' And he said to him, 'I will come and heal him.' But the centurion replied, 'Lord, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it.' When Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, 'Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from the east and the west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.' And to the centurion Jesus said, 'Go, let it be done for you as you have believed.' And the servant was healed at that very moment." Now, there is a sister passage to this that is found in Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. Which not only gives us some additional insight into the character of the centurion, but it also mentions something that some people find to be a contradiction that is either debated or used by some to claim that the Bible has errors. So let's start first by reading the passage and squashing the contradiction part, and then we can rightly shift our focus to how this passage brings out additional context. That passage reads, "After he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, 'He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue.' And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, 'Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you. But say the word, and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes. And to my servant, do this, and he does it.' When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, said, 'I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith.' And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the servant well." The controversy between these two passages arises from Matthew stating in verse 5 that the centurion came up to Jesus, whereas Luke describes it in verses 3 and 4 as the centurion sending elders of the Jews to Jesus. This difference has led some to even say that they are two different miracles, since they were unable to harmonize these two occurrences in these two Gospels. However, while I certainly appreciate those that make this claim by their sticking to the inerrancy of the Bible, the likelihood of two separate centurions in Capernaum both having a servant that was suffering in the same exact way and both saying the exact same things to Jesus, and Jesus likewise saying the exact same thing about the centurion as he was approaching their house is very minuscule at best. That said, there are two very real possibilities that do make these two accounts be able to be harmonized. The first is that the centurion came to Jesus after sending the Jewish elders. In Luke 7:7, the centurion states that he did not presume to come to Jesus since he wasn't worthy for Jesus to enter his house. However, how many of us have asked someone to do something or talk to someone for us, and then as we sit there nervously and anxiously wondering how it will play out, we decide to take the matter into our own hands? Yeah, how many of us guys, for example, and especially in middle school and high school, have sent our friends over to talk us up to a girl that we were interested in, but once we saw that they had broken the ice, we nervously made our way over to introduce ourselves. Now, the second option, which is the one that I personally think is the case, is simply viewing the centurion in Matthew verse 5 as the Jewish elders that were representing the centurion's plea. In this verse, it states that the centurion was appealing to Jesus, but it never says that this was a face-to-face appeal. And it could very easily be interpreted as this appeal being made from the centurion through the means of these messengers. Similarly to how if your boss's secretary approached you at your job and said that your boss wanted you to have TPS reports on his desk by noon, you could easily and truthfully say that your boss appealed to you to get those two TPS reports on his desk.
So, Peter, what's happening? Now, are you going to go ahead and have those TPS reports for us this afternoon?
Another key thing to pay attention to in regards to these differences is the intended audience of the authors. Matthew, like I've mentioned a couple times in this series, focused his gospel to the Jews, and as such, he focuses on the faith of the Gentile centurion. And as such, he also includes Jesus' harsh rebuke of the unbelieving Jews in verses 11 and 12. Luke's focus, on the other hand, was showing how the Gentiles are worthy of hearing and accepting the gospel, and as such, he adds the details of the Jewish elders trying to persuade Jewish to honor the centurion's request, and he emphasizes how these elders called the centurion worthy. It is worth noting, too, though, that while the elders called him worthy, the centurion certainly didn't view himself as such, and adamantly claimed the opposite, which also shows the humble posture that we all need to have to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So hopefully that clears up the matter for any of you that might have been struggling with those differences. So let us now turn our focus on breaking down this passage. So the centurion's appeal comes to Jesus for him to heal not him, not even a member of his family, but his servant, who in verse 6 the centurion describes as lying paralyzed and suffering terribly. And in the King James Version, it actually translates it to say that the servant is sick of palsy, which could very well refer to what is known today as Bell's palsy or cerebral palsy. And those that suffer from Bell's palsy, they do tend to experience involuntary tremors of the face and neck that can be painful. In regards to cerebral palsy, those suffering from that usually experience their muscles contracting, causing spasms that can usually lead to deformities, misaligned joints, and movement problems, all of which results in pain. Whether or not, though, the servant was suffering from one of those conditions or simply paralysis, we simply don't know. All that we can be sure of is that he was unable to move and in tremendous pain. However, since paralysis in and of itself doesn't usually result in pain, there has been some scholarly debate on what he was actually suffering from. And while, like I said, all we do need to know on the matter is that he was unable to move and in pain, since I'm a Bible nerd and I like diving into this stuff, and hopefully you do too, which is why you're here. But one such scholar who makes, I think, a great case on this is Sir R. Bennett, who's an MD himself. And he says, in this instance, we have probably a case of progressive paralysis attended by muscular spasms and involving the respiratory movements, where death is manifestly imminent and inevitable. In such a case, there would be symptoms indicative of great distress as well as immediate danger to life. So, The centurion pleads for Jesus' help, and Jesus then responds, I will come and heal him. Now, in Luke 7, verses 4 and 5, the elders were making a case for why Jesus should do this by saying, he is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue. However, even though these reasons were given to Jesus, in reality, the only plea that was needed to make him come was help. And that stands true today. Yes, one might argue at first glance that, well, since the person who was requesting Jesus' help was not only a Gentile, but also part of the hierarchy that was oppressing God's chosen people, certainly Jesus had to need some reason to go out of his way to help someone who fell into that category. However, we see Jesus later on, even without being prompted to, reattaching and restoring the ear that Peter had chopped off of a Roman soldier who hadn't been doing anything to show that he loved the Jewish nation or built a synagogue or anything like that, but instead he was there to take Jesus to the trial that would ultimately lead him to his crucifixion. Jesus was known for routinely being moved to compassion to help and heal those around him, even if he knew in their hearts that they wouldn't turn to him for salvation. However, despite that fact, the centurion also serves as a reminder that, as 1 Samuel 16:7 tells us, man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And this man's heart was in the right place and was set in the posture of humbleness before our Messiah. Then, as Luke 7:6 and Matthew 8:8 tells us, when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. This, of course, in itself gives further credence to the idea that I mentioned earlier that the Jewish elders were simply representing the centurion's request to Jesus in Matthew 8:5, since it does seem to indicate that the centurion himself was physically in his home when Jesus was responding to his request to heal his servant. However, the most important thing to take away from this verse is the humility and faith of the centurion, especially since most would not expect this from a Gentile, much less anyone employed in the Roman army. Prior to the Roman occupation, the relationship between the Jews and the Gentiles was already one that was heated and on edge due to the strict Jewish laws and customs. So imagine the tension and animosity that existed when Rome began their occupation of their land and paid little to no heed to the Jewish traditions and customs that they valued so dearly. So, this centurion's response, along with his proven character of being a supporter of the Jewish nation, certainly had to have been a breath of fresh air for them. And being someone who was a friend to the Jewish people, he certainly knew that it was unlawful for a Jew to enter into the house of a Gentile, since doing so would make them ceremonially unclean. And as such, this centurion was trying to spare Jesus any embarrassment that might have been caused by him entering into his home. Although, if he had known that Jesus would later sit and eat with tax collectors and prostitutes and speak to a Samaritan woman at the well, along with other examples we could list, then I'm sure he wouldn't have thought anything of it. Regardless, though, he does show a great deal of respect to Jesus. And even more so, he shows a great deal of faith in believing that Jesus doesn't even need to be present, but he just needs to say the word and he knows that his servant will be healed. This type of faith would have been wonderful in an Israelite, but for a Gentile, let alone a Roman centurion to have it, it was something remarkable. Through this man's understanding of the authority that he held as a centurion, he was able to fully recognize Jesus' own authority and capability. And since I'm sure this video will be a long one as they usually are, I will reference the video I did on Matthew 7:24-29, where the last half of that video, I dive deep into the subject of the authority that Jesus had and has, being that before he was ever born into this world, he had enjoyed an eternity with the Father and Holy Spirit, and it was through him that everything was made. And I will link that video in the description below for you. That said, this man was in charge of 100 soldiers. And soldiers back then, as they are now, are trained to instantly and obediently carry out any orders that their leaders give them. So using that logic and having faith in Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God, he had the complete confidence that if Jesus said something, it would be done, and rightly so. Jesus, after all, is the Logos, or the Word. Through his words, he commanded seas to be calm, demons to flee, and his disciples to both come and follow him, as well as to go and spread the gospel to the corners of the earth. As we read in verse 10, when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed him, Truly, I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. Interestingly enough, this is one of the 2 times that Jesus is said to have marveled. and it's the only time that it was done in a positive sense. The other time was in Mark 6:6, where after preaching to his hometown and being rejected, he marveled at their disbelief. While there is no doubt that this kind of faith is the kind that our God wants from us, it does make you wonder why this particular man's faith was the type of faith that made Jesus marvel, though. After all, in the previous passage we studied, we encountered a leper who essentially said the same thing by saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. In our study of that passage, we also went over the story of the daughter, previously known as the woman with the issue of blood, who had the faith that just touching Jesus' cloak would be enough to cure her. So, what was so special about this centurion that made Jesus actually marvel at his faith? While Jesus can be the only one to tell us for sure when we are reunited with him, I do have a guess as to what it might have been. You see, the title of centurion carried with it a high sense of status, authority, and wealth, which is the type of power and clout that can easily lead people into thinking that they deserve everyone's respect and make them think that they don't need God. It's the type of position and wealth that both back then and today can cause people to fall into the trap of being stiff-necked, proud, and arrogant, which the Bible continuously warns us about, both with direct condemnations as well as stories that show just how much the mighty can fall. We see this even today with Instagram influencers thinking that their follower count grants them some special treatment. The vast majority of celebrities and pro athletes being so far from God and so removed from reality that there are whole magazines and shows like TMZs that exist to capture it all. And we even see it, unfortunately, in some churches and pastors like Mark Driscoll, whose drive for power literally left in his wake thousands of hurt Christians. However, for this centurion, despite his position of power, he remained more humble than even the most religious of the Jews. The fact that he also not only went out of his way to help build the synagogue, but also deeply cared about his servant shows the true marks of his character, and that he not only loved God, but he loved people too, despite their social status. Whereas most people in his position would likely just toss that servant to the side and hire a new one, this one viewed his servant as a person made in the image of God, and he was willing to do whatever he could to help him. All right, so all the Jesus people around Jesus were probably a bit shook to their core by hearing Jesus proclaim that this Roman Gentile had more faith in them. What he said next had to have been like a knockout punch to them.
Finish him!
In verses 11 and 12, he says, I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This was one of many different statements that Jesus gave throughout his ministry to try to drive home the point that so many of the Israelites were simply banking on their heritage and being part of God's chosen people, that they refused to believe in Jesus being the fulfillment of the countless prophecies that showed that he was indeed the Messiah, even with all the countless miracles that he performed. As Isaiah 43:19 tried to explain to them, behold, I am doing a new thing. Yet they refused to see or accept it. And if they had just even studied Isaiah 53 alone, which is just one chapter full of these prophecies, they no doubt would have. They certainly believed in God the Father, and despite the numerous references to a Trinitarian God and Jesus in the Old Testament, they had closed themselves off from believing in Jesus, who adamantly tried to tell them, as we read in John 14:6, that he is the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through the Son. And unfortunately, that lack of belief does mean that these individuals will not be granted access into the kingdom of heaven. And instead, they will be cast into outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. Interestingly enough, Jesus himself is the one who mentions and warns about hell far more than any of his apostles ever did in their preaching. Which, when you think about it, kind of makes sense, since being fully God, only he knew exactly what that place was like and the eternal torment and despair that awaited everyone who was not saved. Just like how people who have experienced firsthand the grim reality and horror of war would adamantly tell others that no one should ever wish to take part in it, and they can back that up with clear examples and firsthand experience as to why, while those who haven't personally experienced it can at best simply just make an educated guess of what it's like based on movies or video games. And even based on that experience, they might even agree with those who have experienced it. Yet the conviction of a war-scarred father trying to convince his child to not go to war is coming from a place of experience in that firsthand knowledge. Now, the afterlife is something that we could spend quite some time going over, but I don't want to take this video too far off course. And in the sake of time, I will save that discussion for another video where that is the more focus of the passage that we're going to be studying. But if you would like me to cover that sooner, then please let me know in the comments there. That said, for the last part of this video, let us now focus on the topic of faith and what it is. And it shouldn't surprise us that the best definition of faith comes directly from the Bible. And in Hebrews 11:1, we read that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Now, for most people, this can easily be confused with belief, as in, yes, of course, I believe in God and in Jesus, even though I've never personally seen him. However, believing in him is one thing, while having faith that he died and rose for my sins and has registered my name in heaven is another thing entirely different. After all, even demons believe in Jesus, and they themselves bowed down before him, which unfortunately is something that can be said of them and not most of us who proclaim to be a Christian. But that's a conversation for a topic that we're going to address near the end of this chapter. But belief is certainly needed and essential to have before you can have faith, since faith is something that is based on our belief. God requires belief and trust, especially when we are going through hard times, but it's our faith that makes us strong in those situations, and it's what enables us to be completely convinced in what we are hoping for. So let's take a moment to break down the difference between belief and faith, since, like I said, they are very similar, and you do need to believe before you can even begin to have faith. But belief can be defined as a strongly held opinion, ideal, or worldview that is based off opinions that we form from our interactions in the world, our emotions, how we were raised, the people we surround ourselves with, and their own beliefs, as well as what we have personally read, heard, and seen. Beliefs are not static, and most of them do end up changing over time as we grow and become exposed to new information, ideas, and people. Faith, on the other hand, is static, and while we create our beliefs, we cannot create faith. Instead, it is something that can only be received from God. As Ephesians 2:8-9 tells us, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one may boast." However, while faith is something that is given, it is also something that can fluctuate in intensity. If we were able to plot our faith on a chart, then I'm sure we would all prefer to see the chart as, a smooth slope up to the right. But unfortunately, that is, of course, not the case. And if you've been a Christian for any decent length of time, then certainly you can look back and notice that there were times in your life where your faith was low and at times when it was high. In reality, our charts look like crazy paths of ups and downs that hopefully have a just general drift up towards the upward right. Usually the periods where our faith is at our lowest ends up being the times in our lives where we're feeling like we're being attacked from all sides. And as such, these are the times that the strength of our faith ends up growing drastically. And even though we will likely go through times where our faith feels like it's being suppressed, the foundation of saving faith never leaves us. And really, that foundation of saving faith, meaning the faith that assures us of our salvation, spreads into other areas of our life to provide faith in other ways as well. Since if we have faith that all God did and spoke through the prophets in the Old Testament was fulfilled in Jesus, and if we have faith that Jesus was the Son of God, whose blood was a new covenant that offers us everlasting life in heaven, then we also have faith in everything else that God, Jesus, and the inspired writers of the Bible have to say as well. Biblical faith is rooted in the person of God, in this Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And that allows us to plant our faith not in us or in our abilities, but instead in Him and His abilities. It is this faith that allows us to surrender everything in every situation to Him and lay it at His feet, trusting that it's all in His hands and that He will provide care and comfort. Faith changes how we live our lives and shifts our perspective from being self-centered and self-focused to a kingdom-oriented approach to life, where we view the world through the lens of how to best use our spiritual gifts to honor God, love people, and bring others to know Christ. This is the mark of true faith, which is why in James we read about faith without works being dead, since true faith naturally inclines us to serving God and people in the same way that true love naturally inclines us to show affection and to perform selfless acts for the one that we love. Now, we can't talk about faith without bringing up perhaps one of the most well-known verses on the subject, which is that of Luke 17:5. That reads, "If you had faith like a grain of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you." This is where the topic of faith can become a bit muddy for us. After all, a mustard seed is the smallest seed out there. And just to help you visualize how small one is, I'm going to put up a picture of one for you. So when Jesus tells us that if we have faith just as small as this, that we could act like Doctor Strange and move trees with a simple wave of our hands, it almost sounds insulting, especially when we reflect back on the times that we've prayed our hearts out with the deepest conviction for things ranging from finding a job to the healing of a disease. And yet those prayers sometimes weren't answered, despite having faith that we know was larger than a mustard seed. So the key to understanding what this means, though, it lies not in my ability to have faith, but rather in the power of the one in whom I place my faith in. As C.S. Lewis writes, we must not encourage in ourselves or others any tendency to work up a subjective state, which if we succeeded, we should describe as faith, with the idea that this will somehow ensure the granting of our prayer. The state of mind which desperate desire, working on a strong imagination, can manufacture is not faith in the Christian sense. It is a feat of psychological gymnastics. If it is God's will to uproot and move a mulberry tree or even a mountain, you can rest assured that He will surely move it. And we even get to ask Him to by faith in knowing that He is more than capable of doing so. However, the key thing to remember is that we are talking about God's will and not our own, which is why when Jesus taught people how to pray, the first thing He tells us to ask for after we address the holiness of God is that His will be done and His kingdom come. This is why we have faith that God is with us and for us no matter what the circumstances might be or look like. And this is what emboldens us to courageously proclaim our faith and do God's will. It gives us the even if kind of faith that we mentioned in a recent video where we talked about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who were told to either worship a huge gold statue of King Nebuchadnezzar, and if they didn't, they would be thrown into a fiery furnace. And in Daniel 3:16 through 18, we read their response, which says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God in whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if He doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. But in this situation, their faith certainly did pay off, and I'd highly encourage you to read the rest of that chapter on your own. But with that, I will wrap up today's study. As always, I do hope that you found this both informative and hopefully entertaining as well. If so, I would just ask that you help this content reach others by hitting the like button and leaving a comment, even if it's just a prayer or fire emoji. But I would certainly love to hear from you if you do have any questions or prayer requests. Lastly, if you're not yet subscribed, and if you made it this far, then I would assume that this is the type of Bible study that's right up your alley, and I would love to have you join us here. So please click that subscribe and notification bell below. I do look forward to seeing you next time. God bless and keep you.